Hi, I'm Jennifer, and welcome to the Krewe of Japan podcast, a weekly podcast where we take you on audio journeys through Japanese culture.
This time on Krewe of Japan podcast.
Welcome to our podcast. You've probably heard of culture shock, the feeling of being uneasy when encountering a different culture and way of life from your own. When traveling through Japan, you may experience culture shock, but that's another topic for another day. Did you know there's such a thing as reverse culture shock? Many people prepare themselves for their Japan trip, which includes studying up on the culture and language. Reverse culture shock strikes when you grow accustomed to a culture, but then return home. You weren't quite prepared for your return home and the culture you were so used to before. Now it seems more foreign to you. In this episode, we'll discuss the details of reverse culture shock and the ways you may be able to cope with the change. We'll even tell you our own stories of reverse culture shock. Hopefully, hearing our experiences will help you be more aware of reverse culture shock and help you adjust to your life back at home. All right, we are here today. Hi, Doug. How are you?
Howdy. I'm in a food coma.
Yeah, we're recording this after Thanksgiving, folks. So we're both kind of in our food coma limbo over here.
Yeah.
But I think that's good because, you know, we're kind of talking just us two, no interviews this time. So I think those are, like I said in the past, those are kind of fun. Just you and I talking.
Yeah, laid back. I mean, not that our interviews aren't laid back, but we can just chill.
Yeah, we could just chill. But, you know, this topic isn't too chill.
Yeah, no, this isn't a chill topic.
Yeah, no. So today we're going to be talking about reverse culture shock. Doug and I, we know what reverse culture shock is, but just in case our listeners don't know what reverse culture shock is, it's that uneasy feeling you get when you experiencing a culture that you're coming back to. It's something that like you used to be used to, but no longer, it's very foreign to you now. And, you know, everything that you knew no longer applies.
Yeah, it's definitely, I don't want to say a phenomenon, but it's interesting because you go somewhere and you experience like a shock in that regard. And then I think it's just your body acclimating, or your mind or whatever, your entirety acclimates to X, and then you go back to Y. You know, Y being the original place, which probably be better like A. But you go back to A, your home country, your hometown, or wherever. It doesn't even have to be leaving a country. It could be just here, you know, a city to a city, or East Coast to West Coast, or, you know, state to state.
For sure.
Yeah. So it's kind of crazy. But I think anyone that's moved in their lifetime has probably experienced this to some regard, some extent.
Yeah, I mean, usually it does happen to folks that, you know, are out of their original setting for an extended amount of time. But, you know, it could happen to folks that, you know, are only away for a short amount of time. You never know.
Right.
It just depends on how you as a person react. You know, I think you and I both, when we're talking about reverse culture shock for this episode, you know, specifically we are talking about our time in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Doug, you've lived in Japan as a jet.
Yep.
I've been to Japan for study abroad and for work. So, you know, I feel like you and I have a good understanding of the reverse culture shock.
Yeah. I had it multiple times, obviously. You know, even when I go back for a trip, because I would go back and visit for like 3 weeks. And then I get kind of like, you know, oh, this is nice. And then coming home, it hits you. You know, it doesn't take long. It hits you once you step out at LAX or whatever. But yeah. I mean, it's study abroad, jet. You know, even when I was coming home just for a short period of time, like when I was on jet, I would come home for like 2 weeks or whatever, just as a break.
Yeah.
Like those kind of things. I just think that's, you know, it doesn't take being away a long time, or does it take a long time for you to experience it?
Yeah, I feel like reverse culture shock is probably just as tough as people who suffer from culture shock. If not, maybe even more, because I feel like more people talk about culture shock than reverse culture shock.
Yeah.
I feel like reverse culture shock isn't as well known or talked about as culture shock. And I feel like that's very misleading to a point because you're so focused on like talking about culture shock that you're not preparing people for the journey back home from wherever, they're returning to.
And I think that's a big part. Yeah, that's a great thing you pointed out, because I think everyone focuses on, if you're going somewhere for work and you plan on being there indefinitely, then maybe reverse culture shock isn't as big of a deal. But if it's something where you're going for like study abroad, where you're going for a month or a few months, you're definitely coming home and you're going to experience this to some extent. So like you said, like it's something that is kind of glossed over in terms of like prepping you for your trip, whatever it may be, jet, orientations. They have those, but they talk about culture shock. Now, I think they did mention it when we would have our Leavers conference. I think that's what it was called. When they had that, they did kind of go through like a couple seminars of like reacclimating to your home country and how to go about doing that and what ways to find a support network and all that stuff. So yeah, it's something that isn't really as focused on. And it's funny that we're doing a reverse culture shock episode before the actual culture shock episode.
Right? So. Well, because, I don't know about you, Doug, but I feel like for me, I've never experienced culture shock when it comes to Japan. Because when I went as a study abroad student, that was like my first experience with Japan.
Yeah.
I was so well prepared on like Japanese culture, the language. Like I was ready. I wanted to go. There was no like ifs, ands, or buts about it. I was just super prepared. I got accustomed very well. And I feel like, not my personality per se, but I feel like my way of thinking syncs up with the Japanese way of thinking of things sometimes. So I feel like I really integrated in the culture very, very well.
Yeah.
So I feel like I struggled more with reverse culture shock, the coming back home, because I was so like not in my happy place per se, because Japan does have its issues like every place does.
Yeah.
But I definitely felt at home in Japan more than over here at the time. And so when I returned home, I just had the toughest time. I couldn't interact with people the same way that I used to. It was just really tough. Really, people who need to realize that reverse culture shock can be just as tough as culture shock in general.
We've been kind of bouncing back and forth with culture shock versus reverse culture shock. I think it'd be a good way to, segue into talking about the difference between the two. And we've talked about it a little bit already. Culture shock itself is, you may not experience it like right away. Some people experience it right off getting off the plane. That's like a punch in the face for, anything if you're not prepared. But if you are prepared, you may not experience it. It may take getting to a certain time of year when you are used to doing something that is normal to you. And then it suddenly is not in the place where you are. For me, we're not going to get too far onto the tangent of culture shock, but for me, that was during my study abroad year. I stayed there for Christmas. That was my first Christmas alone. First Christmas away from my family. First Christmas, all that stuff. And for me, it was depressing because Christmas is always a huge holiday for growing up. So being alone, away from family, in a country that didn't really celebrate Christmas the same way that it's celebrated in the U.S., that was huge. Like I felt a little culture shock along the way, but that was really my gut punch in terms of culture shock. But it may take time. Whereas reverse culture shock, I feel like the difference there is that it hits you right when you get home. Like
it does.
Like a bus. Like
immediately.
Yeah, you get slammed with it because you start just noticing things. And it's not even just cultural things. Yeah, sure, you come back and go to like LAX or Houston or whatever big airport you fly into, and people are loud, obnoxious, inconsiderate.
And you thought nothing of it before.
Right. You were used to it before, but then leaving.
Now it irks you.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah, it makes you just get a lot more aware. But those kind of things, it hits you right when you get off the plane. It doesn't take long. But then there's also like non-cultural things, like friends and family have gone through changes while you're gone, and you're expecting them to be the same. Or leave off.
The same with you. I felt like expectations of me from friends and family were like, oh, she's gonna come back the same person. It's like, I just went through like an experience. I've grown. I am no longer the same person.
Yeah, for both sides. That you come back and you've had a life-changing experience. Well, one time, the first time I went was during study abroad, right? I went that fall, literally a month after Katrina happened.
Yeah.
So I came back home in February, and I had left like a few weeks after Katrina, so I had seen kind of like, things in shambles and everything already. And then I came back home and I didn't know what to expect because I knew it wasn't going to be home because the home I thought of pre-Katrina wasn't there anymore.
Yeah.
So it was kind of a weird situation. Like
things
were still
definitely a weird situation.
Yeah, things were like still closed. Yeah, it was wild. But I think that's something that maybe reverse culture shock, I think, probably hits harder than, the actual like cultural changes and differences between the two. But it's coming home and then finding people have changed while you were gone, or relationships have changed. Like people who were dating or married before you left are now divorced or not together anymore. Or things happen, right?
Yeah. Things happen without you.
Right.
Yeah. It's funny that you mentioned like the holiday thing because, and I don't know this makes me a heartless person, but I am definitely not one of those people that's like very family oriented. I'm very much a loner. And so like, I don't have that sentiment of being like, oh, I miss my family during the holidays. Cause my husband and I, we actually took a trip to Japan for our anniversary in the fall. And it just so happened that it landed on the week of Thanksgiving. Speaking of Thanksgiving. And
happy honeymoon anniversary.
Yeah. And so we went and, Jonathan was like, oh man, I miss my family. Like I miss Thanksgiving. I'm like, Japan doesn't celebrate Thanksgiving. They don't have turkey. And so I was like, Jonathan, I'll take you to like this really nice place that does like really, really good chicken. And we'll do... No, not KFC, but like really, really good. Like it was like this very fancy restaurant and it was very nice. And it had like small plates and then like roasted chicken. So I was like, this will work for like a substitute as much as I can. And like, it was very interesting. Like I said, I don't have culture shock with Japan. That's not really a thing for me, not at least for this go round. But it was interesting to see my husband go through culture shock.
Yeah.
And like trying to alleviate his stresses of culture shock and just seeing it from the outside view of it,
Yeah.
Any kind of culture shock, whether it's reversed or regular culture shock, you want to help that person. But in the end, they really have to adjust themselves and they need to learn how to cope with it.
Yeah. It's kind of like a wave, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. Because, one day he's having a great time in Japan. And then like the next, it was, a tougher time for him. He missed speaking English to people. He was only talking to me and he wanted to talk to other people. And of course, he wanted to have like full blown conversation with Japanese people. And that's just not how it works over there. You can't have conversations with strangers over there.
Well, you can. It just depends where you go, right? It's not as easily.
It's not very common at all. And it was taking a toll on him.
Sure.
But then it was very interesting because the same time we come back from Japan and then he gets this reverse culture shock. And I'm like, you just had issues over there, now you're having issues coming back. Because like you said, you step off that flight and, things that were so normal to you before and you wasn't a bother, now it irks you. And it like... Yeah. It makes you mad sometimes.
Or you're like just used to it. You're like, okay, it's not
yeah,
that
you're so used to it that doesn't.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. You're so used to it that it doesn't bother you.
Sure.
But now it bothered you. So I feel like a lot of people need to figure out their really good coping mechanism for either one, honestly, not just reverse culture shock. Whether that's like really talking to someone that you can fully trust, whether that's even just, sitting down in a corner, to yourself, de-stress with like a good book, maybe some music, whatever you feel could be like a really good coping mechanism. Do absolutely like nothing, maybe like a book in my hand and just like de-stress. That's kind of my coping mechanism. I'm not too much of like a talker or like sharing my feelings with people, but I'm very much a like, let me just de-stress in my happy place. And my happy place is usually in a book. So
fair enough. I mean, you got to do what makes you right, like you got to do what makes you feel good. And I think another coping mechanism that is good too, it's kind of the opposite of reading. It's like, isolating and reading a book. But again, it just depends who you are and what you want to do.
Yeah, it does. I
know from Jet, we've had Megan Gack on multiple times, and she was the president of the Jet alumni chapter for New Orleans or Mid-South, which is a few states. And I was also the president at one point, especially right after I came back from JET. I kind of got roped into it. But those networks of like former Jets and everything, they all went through similar situations that you did.
Oh,
So
yeah, for sure.
it's good to, keep in touch or network. I don't even say network because it's not really networking. It's making friends with people
networking.
and just talking.
It's more just like keeping in touch with people that can relate to what you've experienced.
Exactly.
Because that was kind of like how I did it when I studied abroad. No one really understood like where I was coming from, like people who like were here. But like the people that I studied abroad with, like when I talked to them, they understood everything that I was talking about. And so, I did use like them as like a piggyback on for support. But that's a really good point. Using those people that have experienced the same experiences as you.
And it doesn't even have to be the same country. It can be.
Oh yeah, for sure.
It could be like someone who did study abroad in Germany or in Australia or wherever.
Yeah.
But they're going through the same thing. After I came back from study abroad in Tokyo, I think Loyola, the university I went to down here, I think they had like kind of like a study abroad like mixer or something to meet other kids who had just returned back from programs and stuff, and also new students that were studying abroad or exchanging to Loyola. So that way everyone's kind of like, hey, you're going, this person over here is going through the situation you went through when you were abroad. And this may help you kind of reconnect and it's just finding that support structure. If you do want to talk to somebody, find someone that you trust and that can relate. And even, I feel like sometimes just setting the story straight with folks too. And like we talked about earlier, there's an expectation that you're going to be the same and that you haven't gone through these like life-changing experiences or whatever. But sometimes you could just let people know, be like, look, man, like it's just changed. Like same way, be like, look, like let's catch up. Like let's just, if it is someone you haven't really maybe talked to in a long time. I'll say another thing too, though. I this is kind of more back on the culture. Coming back, I struggled with American pop culture and what was in, because I think when I studied abroad, it wasn't as connected as it is now.
I wasn't connected either.
Because there was like torrents and stuff that you could download, pirating and all that crap. A friend told me about pirating. I didn't do it, but there was ways to get music and stuff. And you could search online to find out what was on the top charts if you really wanted to, or what movies were popular. Mm-hmm. But I remember just there's 6 months or years of time when I just was completely disconnected from U.S. pop culture and wasn't aware of movies that came out like from 2005 to 2006 and then 7 to 10. Like there's nice pockets of time when I'm like, oh, when did that movie or song come out? I don't even know. And I'm like, oh, I hear it when I get back. I'm like, oh man, the song's amazing. And they're like, yeah, that came out like 3 years ago, dude. And I'm like, oh, whoops.
Yeah, I remember experiencing that when I came back from study abroad, because before I left, you're in your car listening to the radio and you're like, oh, okay, this is the music that's in right now. And then you come back and you're in your car listening to music and like, I don't know any of these songs. What happened?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that was pretty crazy. That for me, that was wild.
Yeah, no, that is very interesting. I never thought of it until now.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. I remember literally being in my car driving, which FYI, that was reverse culture shock in itself because I didn't drive in Japan.
Yeah. So
it took me a good bit of time to get used to like driving again.
Well, I drove in Japan, and it was reverse culture shock coming back because driving on the opposite side of the road, especially having done it for a while I was over there, 2 years of doing it, I am pretty sure like I had mini anxiety attacks every time I got to a stop sign where it had an intersection. I was like, oh my God, am I turning into the right lane? Like, am I turning into
right.
oncoming traffic,
Yeah, for me, it was more like, having that expression in my mind of, oh, it's like a bike. Once you learn, like, you'll never forget. And it's like, please let that saying be true because I really need to remember how to drive.
Yeah, it was true. But it was just, even like when I come back from like my mini trips that, with family and stuff, like, I'll come back and I'm like, I don't drive usually when I'm on there, but I'm in the passenger seat. And it's just, I have to reacclimate my mind to, opposite side of the road. So it's that was always pretty, I don't want to say funny because it's frightening when you're actually behind the wheel. But yeah. Yeah, no, I remember one of the interesting things that happened with reverse culture shock. We were earlier talking about like immediately experiencing it like right when you come off the plane, and that's exactly what happened.
when traveling from Japan, you're getting jet lag coming back. I don't know. I think everyone thinks, oh, the jet lag going to Japan is really bad, which it can be. But I feel like your excitement of being in Japan like deadens it. At least for me, it does. So I don't get jet lag going to Japan. I get jet lag coming back.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, ew, I'm coming back.
But mine was just, I think it's like I get there and then I usually would just wake up at like 4 a.m. That would be waking up, and then I'd start to hit me in the middle of the day, and then I'd either get a coffee or an energy drink or something. And then if I powered through it, or if I'm doing something that evening, like where I'm active and having to be active, wasn't a big deal. And usually I get over, jet lag going over there after a few days. But coming home, it's like a 2-week affair.
Oh, yeah. Coming home, it's miserable. It's brutal. And I remember it was so brutal that Jonathan was like, I need coffee and I need it now. And so I was like, okay, let's go to one of these kiosks in the LAX and we'll get you a coffee. And we go up to the stand and we order the coffee, and this woman, she probably doesn't want to be there. And I understand that's a very American way of thinking, like, oh, I don't want to be here at my job, blah, 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 blah. And she just gives him the biggest attitude, and she pretty much throws him the coffee and it's like, here you go. And it's like, whoa.
Yeah.
And, coming from a country where you get like the
premier
method
customer
of like
service, right?
Premier customer service, the customer is God kind of mantra, to this kind of service.
Yeah.
My husband just had the worst reverse culture shock with this. He's like, oh my God. Like, he was literally upset. He was like, I feel like I did something wrong because she was so angry.
Yeah. That is definitely one of the first things. Like getting off the plane, like I said earlier, and loud and just people obnoxious and rude. And then that, again, carries over to like customer service, where you would go and people are miserable at their jobs. I mean, maybe they're miserable, probably, unhappy or whatever at the jobs in Japan too. I have no idea, but they don't show it if they are.
No, they don't show it. I don't think they can show it. I don't think they're allowed to show it. Yeah. Whereas in America, I feel like we don't really have any qualms of showing it. We're just kind of like, I don't care what people think, whatever.
And it's like Japan, it's the running joke of it's kind of expected.
Yeah.
So that's definitely another area. I'm trying to think another one where this kind of goes back to friends. I come back and I remember, and I don't know if they listen. If they do, they might know who I'm talking about. But I remember leaving to go to Japan, and a couple friends were together. And then while I was there, they broke up for about a year or so, or an extended period of time, and then got back together right before I got back. So it was like there had been this giant change, but I was away for it. When I came back, it was like nothing had changed. so it was really weird, because like I just remember that one thing, or just also friends maybe moving and living in different places, and you're like, oh, let's go back to your place. I'm like, oh, I don't live there anymore. I'm like, oh, okay. Or like shops being closed that you're not used to, or let's go to that restaurant, or let's go to the store, and they're like, nah, dude, they closed down like 6 months ago. And you're like, oh no. I mean, that happened when I went back to Japan this summer. A lot of things that were open are not anymore due to, obviously with pandemic stuff. COVID, so that was kind of reverse culture shock. I don't know how many reverses that would be for me. That, but yeah, that's something I know I experienced quite a bit, especially that Katrina year, like that, because that wasn't really reverse culture shock. I think it was more culture shock of coming back to New Orleans and seeing it like 40% recovered from Katrina, and that was shocking from where we were before.
Yeah.
So.
That's interesting that you mentioned about things like closing and stuff, because then it reminds me of like actually just going out and eating. That gives me reverse culture shock.
Yeah.
Like, because going to Japan, they give you smaller portions, which I'm fine with. It's perfect for me. I can eat all my food and it's great. And then even their quality of food, I don't feel disgusted with myself after eating most of the time. But then I come back to New Orleans and I'm just like, this is humongous. Like, why are you giving me this huge entire plate of food that I'm not like that I'm not going to be able to eat? It's so bad. And then all the grease. Oh my god, the grease.
I feel obligated to finish the entire plate. And then
I
feel like
I can't. I would be so sick
after I'm done.
Oh my god, I would be so sick if I did.
Yeah. Yeah, no.
That's the beauty of America, we have the whole takeout thing, like to-go stuff. But no, but the quality of food, like I just feel gross when I'm eating when I come back from Japan to like New Orleans, because like everything's so like doused in grease or just bad.
And I think one more thing, it would be remiss not to mention that, in Japan, walking around later at night or whatever, you feel much safer. Going around neighborhoods and whatever. But not to give New Orleans a bad image, but it's definitely it's an American city that has crime. More so lately than not. But, it's something that I have to remind myself, and this is more so when I was, I don't go out as much as I used to anymore. But back when I came back from Jet and back when I came back from study abroad, I had to be like, dude, pull it back. You can't party super late and then walk, that long distance that you used to walk. Because I would sometimes go out and I would walk off like the drinking. I'd stop at a convenience, get some food or whatever drink, like a soft drink or something from the convenience store, and walk like a couple miles back to my apartment or wherever. Mm-hmm. And that would be my way of working it out, right? And then I'd be not having to worry about anything. It'd be safe as hell. But then here, you can't do that, for a variety of reasons. That's one thing I think also reverse culture shock wise, is just that it's not as safe as
it's not
as it can be, or it should be, as we would all love it to be.
Yeah, definitely. And I just feel like the infrastructure here in the city is just not meant for walking, honestly.
Yeah,
it's meant for driving.
Yeah, it's definitely meant for driving. Public transit is definitely not a specialty or something like that add on here in New Orleans. Although the streetcars are kind of nice, but those again, that's
those
only
are
a certain
just in
area.
The city. Yeah.
So that's just something again you have to get used to when you come back home.
Yeah, for sure. Yep, it's a struggle. The struggle bus.
Yeah. So
to come back home.
So you got any other fun stories of reverse culture shock you want to share with us?
Well, not only the eating did I have problems with and the whole like customer service thing, but we're talking about earlier like changing yourself. And I did go through a change, like I said, I studied up on Japanese culture before I left, so I felt very, very comfortable in Japan. I loved the fact, I don't know why. Okay, this is going to sound so weird. I love the whole bowing thing. I love the respect of it. I loved that like you just bowed for like everything. You bowed for thank yous, you bowed for like apologizing, you bowed for everything. And I really, really enjoy that. I think it's very nice. I think it's respectable and it's good manners. And I was like, I really love that. And so when I went to study abroad, I did a bunch of that. I did a bunch of bowing and I just kind of mimicked what like my Japanese friends did, which they bowed. So I'm like, okay, I kind of learned when to do it and all that and how and, how deep of a bow and stuff like that. So coming back home though, I look like a weirdo because I'm bowing. I bowed.
Me.
Not to you. Why would I bow to you? But like, no, like I remember because Jonathan, my husband, would always be like, stop doing that. It's embarrassing. Because like we would go to like a restaurant and like a waitress would do something. I'd be like, oh, thank you. I'd do like a little, one of those like little respectable bows.
Yeah.
And he's like, stop doing that. And I'm like, what?
You gotta do the head
like
nod.
I didn't even realize I was doing it. And he's like, you're doing this thing where you're bowing your head or whatever. Don't do that. I'm like, oh, like it's second nature. That's the thing. It's so second nature to me. Like I do it. I do it all the time. I still do it.
I think I do it too.
It's ingrained in me,
to
honestly.
some extent. I do the head nod. I'm like, oh,
yeah. I do like the little like thank you head nod. Like I do all the time. I do it like when I'm driving and like people like let me pass, go first. I like do the little head bow, like and then go, or like just like I do it all the time, honestly. And I understand it's not a thing that's done here, but I don't know. It's just so ingrained in me. I can't break the habit now. It's kind of just what I do. And I think some people in my life have gotten used to it. But definitely sometimes my husband still like points it out and be like, you still do this thing. And I'm just like, sorry, like that's just how it is.
Yeah.
So like definitely some way of like Japanese life just came back with me, and it just kind of stuck. And it looks weird over here, but over there it's like totally acceptable.
Yeah, no, I like I said, I think I'm pretty sure I still do the head bow. I don't even know if I do it. I'm pretty sure I do, but
the only reason why I know is because Jonathan always points it out to me. He always does. So I'm just like, I can't help it. Like, it's just what it is.
So one thing I do like the Ultraman like forearm karate chop thing where I'm like kind of like going through. I'm like, excuse me. Like that.
You do
like,
that? Oh, I don't do that. I know what you're talking about.
I don't know why. I started a long time ago, and it's just like I picked it up from like students or teachers when I was there, and I just never let it go. I don't know why. But and then I don't even know if that's like uniquely Japan, but I know it is done in Japan. And
well, I actually noticed that I just did this. So while you were talking, I just did the whole like reaffirming that like I'm listening to you. Yeah. That's the thing. See, I do so many things that are like little quirks. Like in Japan, it's normal, but here it's like, why are you doing that? Why are you interrupting me? It would almost seem like.
Yeah.
But to me, I'm not. In my way of thinking, the Japanese way of thinking, I'm not interrupting you. I'm just confirming, like, oh, okay, I'm listening to what you're saying.
Yeah.
And I remember, like, some people would point that out, like, why do you do that while I'm talking? And I'm like, huh? Like, you do this thing where you like just like agreeing and making like that little affirmation sound. I'm like, oh well, I'm just like letting you know, like I'm listening to you, like I'm not ignoring you, or, letting you ramble on and me thinking like you're what you're saying is important. Like I really am thinking like what you're saying is important. So yeah, no, these like I said, those little Japanese customs that like I learned and I brought with me. It never went away.
Yeah, they worked their way in.
Yeah, they do. And that's the thing. Like, to you, it seems fine and normal.
Right.
But when you come back home, it's not.
Well, yeah, it's just like little, I don't want to say quirks, but it's little things that are just different, like minor differences and subtle
just
differences.
Minor differences. That's why I'm like, it's minor differences. It shouldn't be too big of a life-changing thing, but some people back home just make it sound like it's revolutionary that you're like this different person. You do these different things now. And it's like, why are you making it a big deal? It's really not that. At least I don't think it's a big deal. But they make it seem like something's wrong with me, even though I know that nothing is wrong with me. I'm just, it resonates with me. So I have really hard time struggling with the reverse culture shock.
So I don't know if this is reverse culture shock, but when you would come back from Japan, people would always ask you, how was Japan? How would you like? I always am like, it was good. Yeah. I had a good time. It's not really reverse culture shock, but I always would get that question. And I know it's like, how's Japan? I'm like, crap. I mean, you want me to like summarize my entire trip in like one sentence? Like, how was it? It was good. It was Japanese. But it was always like one of those things that I always would get back from a trip, and people would ask me that nonstop. And no offense to anyone that would ask that, because I know I've asked that to people. I'm like, man, how's it like being back in Japan? How was it? How's Japan?
And you're right. I don't know if that's actually reverse culture shock, but I do understand what you're talking about, because when I went to Japan for work, it was no longer for like vacation or anything. And I went for work. For me, going there for work was such a different experience than going there as like a tourist and like having fun. Like I had more free time. I was with people, whereas at work, I wasn't going out having as much fun because I was working. And then I was alone. I didn't go with people like friends or my husband. Mm-hmm. So it was like a very different experience. So yeah, when I came back from the work visit of Japan, people were like, oh, how's Japan? I'm like, It was Japan. It was living. Like, what do you want from me? Right. So I understand. Yeah. For you, it's like every time you go visit your Japanese family. Yeah. I can understand that way of thinking of like coming back and be like, oh, it was just, visiting my family.
Just chilled.
Went to 7-Eleven.
It's
to chill.
7-Eleven and the grocery store.
Yeah.
Had some yakiniku.
Sounds like me with my job, you
Yeah.
know? It was definitely, I visited grocery stores like all the time. Yeah, it was just a different experience. So, yeah, but I don't know if I would call that culture shock, but yeah, definitely the expectations.
It's probably not really reverse culture shock, but it would always be coming back home. That was always something
the
people
would be
ask.
like, "Oh, it's exciting. You went to Japan."
What did you do?
It's like
oh my
that's
God. Yeah.
And it's like that's normal for me to like
to
go to Japan and come back. Like that's a
It's your
normal
work.
occurrence now. Yeah. But yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of any other stories. I don't think I have anything else. I've kind of briefly mentioned them here and there.
Yeah.
I think, well, let's see. Really, the big one was like Katrina was weird. And then I would come back.
Imagine that being weird.
I would come back for Christmas every year when I started Jet. I would come back about the week before Christmas or maybe a few days before Christmas, and I'd stick around till like January 6th or 5th or whatever. So a couple weeks. That was always fun. I always would have the excitement of being back home and seeing family and being there for Christmas. But then I think part of reverse culture shock would hit during those 2 weeks of just being back home. And I'd be like, man, like, because I knew I was going back to Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So part of me would be like, towards the end of the trip, I'm like, I just want to be back in Japan, like in my apartment, in my life, in my day to day. Like, because it was weird because I was like on vacation for 2 weeks as opposed to being home. And so that was like I don't want to say different version of reverse culture shock, because I don't know if it was reverse culture shock or me just having culture shock going back to the US on vacation.
Oh, okay.
So that was always kind of a weird way, because then I would get back to Japan and then that would be my normal life. Like that was my normal life. And there would be some quote unquote reverse culture shock going back to Japan after being in the US. And usually that reverse culture shock would be like, oh, you got fat over the time like the US. Oh, you ate good, huh? And like that was my reverse culture shock, being like, yeah, I'm back in Japan.
That's funny. Well, it's funny because you were like, oh, I go back home during, the holidays, and usually holidays land during like fall and winter.
Yeah.
But I went to Japan most of the time in the summer.
Right.
And so, experiencing that beautiful, gorgeous Japanese heat, people would always like complain about how hot it is here in New Orleans. I'm just like, bruh, summer in Japan is like hot. It's hot. I was like, if you can deal with New Orleans heat, you good with Japan. But like Japan heat coming back to here, it's like nothing.
Yeah, it's the humidity and I don't know. We talked about this a lot already on other episodes, but yeah, that heat is on other episodes, brutal. Yeah,
it is brutal. And so like people are complaining here about the heat. I'm like, this is nothing. What are you talking about? And I feel like that's like also reverse culture shock, because they're like, what are you talking about? Like, it's so hot. And I'm like, no, like I could wear a long sleeve and I'll be fine.
I think it's the fact that you just can't escape it.
Yeah, maybe.
I think in the US you can duck indoors into central air and heavy insulation and hide away from the heat, whereas you're a little bit more exposed depending on where you are. Windows open. Yeah.
For sure.
Well, I don't know. I don't really have any other. I kind of touched on a lot of my culture shock stories along the way, or reverse culture shock stories.
Yeah, reverse culture shock. I'm sure we'll have an episode on actual culture shock in season 4, maybe.
Yeah.
But definitely wanted to talk about reverse culture shock. I remember when we were discussing like this episode, we were discussing like, should we do both at once, like cover both topics at once, or should we make them both individual episodes? And I felt like reverse culture shock needed its own episode, because it is important to make it aware to people that reverse culture shock exists. And like I said before, I don't think enough people talk about it, and it needs to be talked about, because when people come home, that's just as important as going to the culture that you're going to.
It's a big part of a trip. It's the end point. It's the terminus.
I think it's the most looked like, just people don't look at it often. And I feel like it definitely needs to be, shine some light on this topic, because it's a big change coming back. So
no, you're spot on. I think it's such a overlooked part of any kind of short or long-term trip to another country or to another place, because if there is an intention of you coming back home, then you will experience reverse culture shock in some degree.
Yeah,
more than you would think. It was fun talking about your side of things and my side of things. It was fun.
Yeah. I'm very aware of reverse culture shock, so that's why I find the topic very important, just because I do get hit more with reverse culture shock than culture shock. But we'll talk about culture shock, like I said, in a future episode, and you'll hear, the culture shock that I did get. But I definitely do relate more to the reverse culture shock. So I'm glad we did this episode together.
For sure. Yeah, it was fun.
Thank you for coming on and talking about it with me.
Yeah, no problem.
And that's it for this week's episode. Thank you for tuning into our podcast. We hope you learned a lot about reverse culture shock. Maybe now you will be able to recognize it if you seem to have an uneasy feeling upon your return from a future Japan trip. Have you possibly had reverse culture shock before? Share your story with us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Krewe of Japan Podcast. That's KREWEOFJAPAN. While you're there, give us a follow, like, retweet, share, whatever. Let us know how you're enjoying the podcast. That's it for today. Until next time.